Hello and welcome to CANNAMAntv. My name is Connor McLeod, and in this extremely informative interview, I speak with the Media Relations Director for the National Cannabis Industry Association, Morgan Fox. In this interview, we discuss the differences in state legislation relating to cannabis and why legalisation is crucial for a thriving cannabis industry, the economic and social impact of cannabis legalisation, what is necessary to dismantle the narrative that cannabis is a harmful substance, differences between recreational and medicinal cannabis, what the future looks like globally for cannabis, and the urgent need for innovation in order to reduce the carbon footprint caused by the cannabis industry. Make sure to like and subscribe, and join me on Patreon, where you can help to build a stronger cannabis media platform for £3 a month. Now then, let's talk cannabis. Essentially, for people that are unaware of the organisation, how would you describe what the National Industry for Cannabis Association is, and what's essentially the goals and ethos behind it?
Well, the National Cannabis Industry Association started in 2010 and was the very first cannabis trade association organizing cannabis businesses that were becoming increasingly common under the auspices of what then was called the Ogden Memo, which was basically a federal guideline to the Department of Justice not to interfere with state level medical cannabis programs that had been in existence since 1995. And at that point, I think there were probably a dozen or so. And so there was an increasing need to mobilize the cannabis businesses that were operating federally illegally, but still with some semblance of protection under both state law and federal guidelines in order to help protect their best interests and further the interests of both the legalization movement and of the industry itself. So, the organization has been doing that strong now for going on 11 years. We are still the largest and most broadly representative cannabis trade association in the country right now, with nearly 2,000 members. And our basic goals are to create a regulatory structure that is conducive to the safe and effective operations of cannabis businesses at both the state and federal level, but primarily at the federal level, and to end prohibition so that states feel more comfortable enacting their own regulated cannabis systems. We're also working to create an environment that really makes the cannabis industry stand out from other industries that have come before it and take advantage of the opportunity that we have to create a brand new industry with a different set of values that's focused on things like sustainability, inclusivity, diversity, and giving back to the communities in which they operate.
That is like fantastic stuff. So, do you see it as essentially the association going to be authentic when, because inevitably federal legalization will happen? Is this going to be a transitional element that you are essentially putting a structure in place for when that time happens?
Well, considering that members of Congress are taking our meetings on a regular basis now, I think that we're well past authentic. And, really, when you look at it, we operate just like any other trade association, but with the unfortunate issues that, the product that our businesses sell, as well as the ancillary businesses that service those companies, are generally still considered federally illegal. It's a very strange position to be in, and one that other trade federations are not. So we have a little bit more of a focus on federal lobbying than a lot of other organizations do at this point. That focuses on much broader issues as opposed to just small minutia of regulatory issues that most other trade associations focus on when they're involved in federal lobbying. But we're also at the forefront of providing our members and other people in the cannabis space with best practices and educational resources and networking opportunities to make this industry that is now increasingly seen as legitimate operate under the best possible framework that it can, and to make sure that particularly small businesses survive and thrive under this very, very difficult regulatory framework.
That's very exciting. So, do you think that education is the main weapon, to use a poor choice of words, that we could really to undo the narrative or the inefficient structure that's made cannabis prohibited the entire time? Do you think that education is the way forward?
Well, I think that education is definitely a key part of it, but that's a pretty broad subject. So, when we're talking about educating our members, we're providing them with tools that they need to be able to operate more efficiently or to engage with best practices, as well as to connect with each other to learn how they can improve their businesses and foster innovation. When we're talking about lobbying, whether it's at the state or federal level, but particularly at the federal level, it's about educating lawmakers about the fact that this is a substance that is objectively safer than alcohol, that has significantly more medical benefits than have been previously realized, that the harms associated with keeping this product illegal have vastly outstripped the harms that the actual substance can cause, and that primarily also educating them that they can actually support this sort of thing without worrying about not getting reelected, because this is something that in the States, at least, more than 2/3 of the adult population supports, and you're hard pressed in this country right now to find anything that 2/3 of the people support.
So what is the main hurdles then that you experience on a daily basis? What is the main difficulties that you are faced with?
If you look at it generally, I think that the biggest difficulty that we face, particularly when it comes to talking to members of Congress, is decades of misinformation about the relative harms of cannabis related to alcohol and other products, but also that, really just showing them that we've got dozens of states now that have successfully regulated this substance, and that the rhetoric that they're using to oppose sensible cannabis policy reforms at the federal level is outdated and incorrect.
So where does medicinal cannabis fit into the framework?
Well, honestly, I think that that is a big question when it comes down to some of the details, such as do patients get taxed at a lower rate than adult use consumers, things like that, in terms of licensing. But, really when it comes down to it, there are some people out there that say that all cannabis consumption is medical in some fashion, but whether or not you ascribe to that particular mindset, the fact of the matter is that adult use cannabis regulation provides medical access to a much wider array of potential patients than most of the medical cannabis programs at the state level that have existed up until now, largely because adult use programs don't require a qualifying condition list. And there are a couple of states that allow it to be up to the determination of the recommending physician. But, for the most part, most of the states have pretty strict qualifying conditions lists, which means that anybody who might have the potential to find medical relief for whatever condition they may have, if they don't fit outside or inside that list of qualifying conditions, they're not going to have legal access until access is legalized for adults. And so, it's really important to kind of look at them as just parts of a whole when it comes to safe and reliable and regulated access to cannabis, and making sure that patients are not consuming products that originated in the unregulated market.
Mm. Do you have a particular structure that you propose when you are engaged with talks with members of Congress relating to the adult recreational market, and how that would be most effectively tailored?
Well, it really depends on who you're talking to. Generally, if you're talking to Democrats, you can focus on the negative social impacts that prohibition has had, and on how the cannabis industry, to a very small extent so far, but an increasing extent, is helping to repair those harms that were caused by prohibition for decades, particularly to marginalized communities. If you're talking to Republicans, it's usually better to talk money and say, like, this is a huge waste of taxpayer dollars when we could be, going after everybody from street level dealers to cartels, when we could be regulating this substance and taxing it and developing legitimate economic revenue and economic activity at a time when we need it the most. And across the board, no matter who you're talking to, whether it's Democrat or Republican, it's useful to show them poll numbers. This is something that the American people back by a huge majority, and no matter what side of the political aisle you're on, by supporting cannabis policy reforms, you can raise your poll numbers by at least a couple of points, even in the most conservative of districts. So this is a win-win for them.
Yeah. Do you have obviously medical? Very often there's the the preservation of the medical product is obviously crucial, the removing toxicants and all these kind of things. Do you have an approach when it comes to these kind of things as a safeguard for companies that might be engaged with that?
Well, a number of states have operated sort of bifurcated systems,
right,
where there will be a distinct adult use system, but then there will be a medical system where there are specific dispensaries, or even sometimes within the same dispensary, there will be, the medical counter and the adult use counter. And adult use patients will not necessarily be able to access either the solely medical dispensary or the medical counter at their local retailer. And so generally, the medical patients have to pay fewer, if not no taxes. And there are a number of producers that are specifically targeting the medical market and providing them with strains that aren't necessarily popular on the adult use market, but that patients have found to provide specific relief for certain conditions. And, even in the adult use market, there are still producers out there that still have that ethos and want to do that. But that largely exists in smaller businesses, whereas some of the larger, multi-state operators have much less concern about that and are much more concerned about providing a legal, safe, regulated, high-quality product that is going to have the biggest consumer draw. And we've seen that sometimes that has created problems where patients are not able to find the strains that work for them as easily, or they end up paying exorbitant prices. But generally, across the board, what we've seen is that when an adult use law is passed in a medical state, even if the programs are not bifurcated and they're kind of lumped together, overall, the price line for patients goes down significantly.
I mean, do you think that what you described as the dichotomy of the recreational availability and medicinal availability, do you think that's the preferred mode, the preferred structure? Do you think that's the most favourable, that everybody wins, or do you think that do you see failings with that?
Well, I think that especially when we come to federal regulation, when prohibition is finally lifted on a national level, I mean, obviously there's still going to be states that are holdouts, but that will provide a lot more guidance, and we still don't know exactly what that's going to look like. There are a lot of stakeholders involved, all with their own concerns about these issues. But I think that one thing that generally everybody agrees on is that medicine should not be taxed and should be available at an affordable rate, and that medical patients should be able to obtain more cannabis per month than adult use programs generally allow. So, there are some things that I think that across the board people agree upon, and the trick is just figuring out exactly how that works, both at a state to state level, but also at a federal level eventually.
Yeah. Do you have, I'm probably incorrect by saying this, but do you have a difficulty dealing with CBD? Is CBD relatively demonized in a sense, or is CBD, available? I think I read somewhere probably a few months ago now that CBD was prohibited in 2 or 3 states that were still becoming relatively, cannabis access was quite available.
Well, CBD is a very difficult issue because, technically it is legal pretty much everywhere, unless there's places where state law specifically prohibits it. And that in some ways has been really good for the industry in general, and in other ways bad, largely because the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, has so far been punting on actually regulating this substance, which means that there are a lot of unregulated operators and manufacturers out there, and they're able to sell these products online. You don't necessarily know exactly what's in them. And really, like, the only way to make sure that you have 100% safe and regulated CBD products is if you're buying them under the auspices of existing state level cannabis and CBD programs that have actual regulatory control over the whole production and retail process. There are a lot of companies out there that are selling unregulated CBD products that are actually self-regulating and that are responsible businesses that are making sure to test their products and making sure that their labeling is 100% accurate and getting rid of any batches that might have adulterants or contaminants in them. But there are a lot of others out there that aren't doing that, and that presents a problem for consumers, as well as the potential for putting a stain on the this market as it's at its most crucial point when it comes to reform. So it's a little bit of a double-edged sword. And additionally, we've seen that one of the big reasons for things like Delta 8, and I'm not sure if that has infiltrated the Scottish market yet, but it's basically produced by taking raw CBD, usually derived from legal hemp products, And because the FDA has not regulated it yet, most of the big retailers like Walmart and places like that are still unwilling to carry those products, which means that there are a lot of CBD producers that are sitting on literally mountains of CBD distillate. And one thing that some of them have decided to do was take that substance and chemically alter it into delta 8 THC, which while is present in the cannabis plant, it's only present in very, very minute amounts. And there's really not that much research on it, what it actually does to the human body in terms of physical or mental effects, or just general consumer safety. But because this substance is almost entirely unregulated, except for a few states that have stepped up and started to jump into it, it's something that while, even if it is completely safe, and we don't know that yet, the way in which it's being manufactured is not, because it takes a tremendous amount of chemistry and production knowledge to be able to do it correctly. And just anecdotally from people that I've spoken with who have been doing spot tests in the D8 market, a lot of this stuff has unknown chemical compounds in it, up to 25% or sometimes more. And the fact that we don't have any sort of regulatory control over how this substance is produced is really problematic for consumers, and really sets a bad precedent. So we're clearly not like calling for things like that to be banned at all, because we want to move away from criminalization, but we need to figure out a way to be able to incorporate minor and novel cannabinoids and the innovation, particularly when it comes to intoxicating cannabinoids, to figure out a way to bring them into the regulatory supply chain, and to do so in a well-considered manner that isn't going to put consumers at risk, and also isn't going to subvert the very hard-won legal wins that the regulated market has, especially considering the tremendous financial burden that is on them in order to be able to operate in compliance with state laws. For people that are spending just ridiculous amounts of money and are in the financial red book over and over and over again just to stay in compliance with state law, and to be able to provide plant-derived cannabinoids, or even chemically synthesized cannabinoids from plant-derived compounds, for them to have to compete with people that are completely unregulated and selling a product that is very similar to the product that is their primary retail lifeline, is really a slap in the face for a lot of people. So we need to find a way to bridge that gap. And there's a lot of really smart people working on exactly how to do that right now, but I don't think that anybody really has the answer at this point. But there's going to have to be a pathway for innovative cannabinoid compounds to be able to enter the regulated market in a way that protects consumers and businesses and generally public safety.
That's actually very interesting, Delta 8, because I am aware of the compound itself. However, I was unaware that it was essentially a synthetic. I assumed that it would be plant-derived, but...
Well, it's synthesized from a plant-derived compound.
All right, okay, right, okay. So, I mean, essentially, what is the overall approach, then, that your organisation has towards synthetic cannabinoids? Is there do you welcome them as wholeheartedly as, full plant extract, or is it just, it has a place like everything?
Well, at this point, our position is that any intoxicating cannabinoids or anything that can produce euphoric effects should be regulated just the same way that delta 9 THC is under the auspices of existing state level programs. While we learn more about these particular substances and determine whether or not that's an appropriate regulatory position for it to be in. For non-euphoria inducing cannabinoids, I think that you could probably regulate them much more similarly to CBD, but this is an ongoing process. Again, we don't want to see bans, but we want to see thoughtful and considerate regulatory control. And until we know more about these substances and what they do to the human body, not to mention what they'll do to existing cannabis markets, the most appropriate place to put them is to regulate them the way that delta 9 plant-derived THC is regulated at the state level.
And once you get to that stage where it's federally available, do you see a unified regulatory framework that will incorporate a lot of these things, or do you think you'll still be dealing with a compartmentalized hurdle depending on each state?
It'll be a combination of both for certain. there will be a certain set of federal regulations that govern things like what sort of pesticides you're supposed to be using, what sort of advertising you're allowed to use. There will probably be some sort of a structure for getting individual products and new cannabinoids patented, or if not patented, approved by the FDA. But there's also going to be a significant amount of state level control, both just because of the nature of federalism in the United States and the way that state and federal law interplays, but also because the states have different approaches to this, in some cases wildly different. And, I think that federal law is going to be very useful in providing guardrails for them and providing them with the best sort of standardized protocols possible. But individual states are going to continue to have the power to do a lot of things on their own that might be different from other states or different from federal law, as long as they meet certain criteria. And the same thing is currently true for the way that alcohol is produced and marketed in this country.
Right. It's certainly very exciting, looking over the water at what you guys are doing over there. I mean, in the past few years, obviously, since you joined the organisation, what are the main steps forward that you've seen internally with how you approach cannabis reform?
Well, I mean, I've been working in cannabis policy reform for the last 15 years or so, and just joined NCIA roughly 3.5 years ago. And just in that 3.5 years, we've seen probably more than a dozen states switch over from either a medical or complete prohibition to adult use programs. We've seen half a dozen more medical programs start up, but most importantly, I think at the federal level, we've started to see actual real momentum and traction when it comes to changing these laws. Specifically for incremental reforms, such as the Safe Banking Act. But I mean, even going back further, every single year since 2014, we have seen provisions in the yearly budget at the federal level include protections for medical cannabis businesses from prosecution simply because of violating federal law. And we're on the cusp of having those extensions, at least in terms of the budget process, extended to adult use businesses. Over the last couple of years, we've seen the Safe Banking Act, which would protect financial institutions that want to work with legal or state legal cannabis businesses from prosecution, approved 5 different times in the House of Representatives. It's still at loggerheads in the Senate, but we're working on that. And last year, for the first time ever, we saw a comprehensive bill to remove cannabis from the schedule of controlled substances and provide a regulatory framework from it, which essentially legalization at the federal level pass through the House of Representatives by a huge margin. With bipartisan support. So, I think that momentum at the federal level is just growing and growing, and even despite the partisan rancor that is going on in the United States Congress right now. But over the last few years, we've also seen, in addition to all these states adding legal cannabis programs, we've seen general approval for legalizing cannabis at the federal level as well as at the state level increasing across the country at really high rates. It's really kind of mind-boggling at how quickly the stigma around this substance has been removed, and how much it has become to be fairly integrated in popular culture, in law, in policy, in everything from I guess a big question or a big point would be the way it's dealt with in the workplace, where we're seeing an increasing number of employers no longer testing for cannabis. We're starting to see movement in that direction, even towards like federal government employees. And it's certainly already there at the state level. There are even some states where, people aren't even tested for cannabis if they're employed by law enforcement. So just seeing that stigma erode so quickly in conjunction with just a huge increase of the number of states that have effectively regulated cannabis, and the amount of momentum that we're getting at the federal level as well as at the cultural level is really something to behold. That's
really exciting. I mean, like anything, I think a lot of the time there is a knock-on effect from what happens, obviously, where you guys are in the States to over here. It's very noticeable. People are aware of that circumstance. And one of the things when you mentioned about the safe banking situation, we have a similar dynamic where there was a report produced this year from, I think it was Macro Solicitors and Maple Tree Consultants, who it was a report of 10 recommendations that they were given to the government that they could usher in much more efficient formats for cannabis and hemp and these kind of things. One of the things was included within that was to remove them from the companies that were engaged with cannabis, CBD predominantly, obviously that's where the stage is at the moment, was so that they weren't held as proceeds of crime. So that the finance that was essentially collected through their legitimate engagement through business was not removed or heavily taxed in any way, shape, or form. So there are small steps over here, but nothing to what you guys are pushing over there. I mean, does that the safe banking situation you were describing a minute ago there? Is that in action now, or is that like almost in a place where everybody can benefit?
We're getting closer, but I mean, even if it passes without comprehensive reform, big banks and big, multinational financial institutions are probably not going to get into the industry immediately. But community banks and smaller and state level, mid-sized banks and lending institutions absolutely will. And I think that the thing to remind people of is that in the United States as well as internationally, bigger companies don't have any problem accessing banks at this point because they're dealing with so much money. They're going to find somebody to carry their bank accounts. They don't have any problem accessing capital because they can get traditional lending from those financial institutions, or they can have access to deep financial networks and angel investors and VC capital, whereas small businesses don't have any of that. They can barely get bank accounts. And if they do, they have got to pay like $10,000 a month just to keep them open. And then thinking about traditional lending and access to capital, it's almost non-existent other than borrowing from family members, which directly contradicts the idea of trying to use the cannabis industry to build generational wealth for communities that have been robbed of it because of decades of prohibition and disparate enforcement, both racially and economically. So, the Safe Banking Act is really about protecting small businesses until federal legalization happens. And, the same thing goes, across the board internationally. There are a number of companies based in the EU, based in Canada, even based in the United States that are active all over the world, and they don't have any issue with banks. It's the little guys and the mom and pops that really need this the most, and they're just not getting it. And the longer the status quo remains, the more time that the bigger operators have to cement their position in the market, which is really unfortunate. And going back to your earlier point, I think that the U.S. really kind of led the way at the state level. But if you're talking about in terms of like national law, there's already a number of countries that have already surpassed us. Uruguay, just most recently, Malta, Canada. It looks like Germany is about to be added to the list very soon. I believe Macedonia is probably going to be added to that list very soon if it hasn't already. So really, the United States federal government is falling behind very quickly as people around the world see the potential for this plant, the potential for the benefits that the market for it can have when it's moved from an unregulated and in many cases criminal paradigm and into the paradigm of legitimate businesses. And they're starting to outpace the US.
Globally, what do you think cannabis is going to look like in a couple of years? Because as you mentioned, there's numerous European countries and other countries around the world who have really led the way when it comes to legalizing cannabis, and they're really, like pushing it forward. I mean, do you see that this is just like yourself, obviously with your organization, that you planning for a multinational influence across the whole board, or is it just speculation, take it as it comes?
Well, I think that that's a difficult question to answer, because clearly we're seeing a lot of individual countries moving much quicker than others towards this, particularly in Africa and in the EU and in Latin America. I think that Asia is a little bit behind the curve, largely because they are currently have some of the most harsh drug policies on the planet. But most of these countries are also signatories of the 1961 Single Convention on Narcotics. And so there are a lot of folks that are worried about violating international law and or at least violating international treaty. And unfortunately, while there is a certain segment within the UN that is really gung-ho about making positive changes in the direction of harm reduction and removing cannabis from the overall war on drugs scenario, but are also trying to dismantle the war on drugs globally, are getting a lot of pushback from some of the controlling companies or countries within the EU that wield, or within the UN, that wield a lot of power. May actually still be the case that Russia is one of the highest ranking members on the United Nations Office of Drug Control. And that's a country that has shown zero progress, and in fact, quite a bit of backsliding when it comes to drug policy and harm reduction across the board. Very recently, a report from, I believe it was an organization based in Great Britain that was proposing, or basically just even reporting on the amount of violence that's directly tied to prohibition, and UN officials prevented that from being disseminated in the official record. So there's still a lot of animus towards making these reforms, and a lot of obstacles in the way of actually being able to get UN member countries to move forward without fearing that they're going to be, jeopardizing their position within the UN. So, I mean, this is something that there are a number of organizations that are working on constantly, and that work is really invaluable. But there are a number of countries out there that are pushing forward regardless.
It's actually really frustrating. I was thinking about this earlier, about the ambiguity behind what is regarded as an intoxicant, or a drug for that matter. And one of the things I was thinking, I was like, because obviously cannabis, as you're fully aware, it has a multitude of molecules, the phytochemical compounds. It's enormous, and that's just even just including the cannabinoids, 100 plus cannabinoids. And one of the things I think to myself, if you take out THC and whatever other relevant cannabinoid which can have a psychoactive impact, you're now dealing with a plant which is non-narcotic. Therefore, that's no longer a drug. And I think this is one of the potential difficulties when it comes to the dialogue that's happened with individuals who have an influence in this arena of discussion. Whereas the reality is, it's like you can have 5 sets of forms of cannabis in front of you, and there can only be one that can be regarded in the context as an intoxicant. So how can there be any legislative policy which says that this plant itself is illegal? Do you know?
Well, I mean, even if you're taking the same strain of plant, depending on the growing conditions, you could have anywhere from 2% Delta-9 THC content to 30%, depending on exactly how you're growing it with the exact same phenotype and genotype. So it's really something that I think can best be addressed by showing that even pure Delta-9 THC should not be classified as a narcotic. And I think that's really the base message that we should be sending, but also the fact that our attempts to try to criminalize this wildly popular product has been available and in use by humans for thousands of years, has created nothing but pain and bloodshed at tremendous financial and human cost around the globe, as well as if we really look into the details of the historical methods of enacting the war on drugs, particularly the United States' role in it, in exporting it around the world, particularly like focusing on supply side economics and interdiction, it has frankly weakened democracies globally, and it created nothing but pain and hardship. And as long as we can continue to put those facts in front of the people that are able to make these decisions, and show them that there are examples around the world and throughout the United States of being able to effectively regulate these substances, in various different forms, and then also combine that message with the fact that this is an economic opportunity globally to take money out of the hands of the unregulated market and put it into the hands of regulated markets that are transparent and generate tax revenue both for their member countries as well as for the localities, that's going to be an increasingly effective argument. We just have to get through a lot of the misinformation and dogma that has persisted in governmental bodies, high and low, for the last 50 years. I mean, really since before the signing of the Single Convention in 1961.
Yeah. Do you think that it's a practical method to apply cannabinoids in the same category such as vitamins and minerals?
I think there's a lot of debate about that. Some of them certainly do belong in that categorization. Some of them probably do not. Some of them probably need to be, particularly Delta-9 and other inebriating cannabinoids should probably be dealt with more along the lines of alcohol, although with the caveat that this is an objectively safer substance. and it doesn't have the same sort of associations with chronic illness, with violence, with aggression, et cetera. And it's also impossible to overdose from it. So, we have to take these things, looking at them respectively to each other, and regulate them on an international basis, as well as country by country and locally along those lines. But you can't do that without research and without facts at your fingertips. And a lot of this information is already beyond doubt. It's been studied heavily, but especially when you're talking about new cannabinoids or some of the novel cannabinoids that haven't been studied as much, we need a lot more research. And the status quo, for better or worse, or no, always for worse, but maybe unintentionally, and in certain cases in the United States, definitely intentionally, has prevented research into the potential medical benefits of any of these, which also stymies the ability to determine their potential harms in most contexts. So in general, what we need is to get out of the way of research being done at the very least, so that internationally we can make more informed policy choices. And you can't do that when you have such strict criminal controls. You also can't do that when you have such strict controls over import-export. Scientists need to be able to send study samples and research product internationally, and in many cases they're not able to do that.
Yeah, I think that's a crucial point, research, because like you mentioned there perfectly, it's research should be the precursor to essentially legislative regulation. Really, that should be the case. There's no point in regulating something when the science isn't there to back the level of impact that it could potentially have. So, what do you think could, apart from pushing through on a federal basis, what would you say would be an initial step towards further research, remove the stigma for research to be able to access the plant in the first place?
Well, in the United States, there are a number of bills that are currently being considered by Congress that are designed to remove the barriers to research to greater or lesser extents. Those would be great to be able to pass as soon as possible. I mean, those are no-brainers. But at the same time, limiting ourselves to those and waiting around years for that research to come in, when in many cases the research that we need is already right there, is self-defeating. Because when you come down to it, like, we don't need a lot of research to see that prohibition has been an abject failure, across the planet. And while we may need significantly more research to determine the nuances of what federal and international policy should be, we know for a fact what is not working and what is ruining people's lives every single day. I mean, in the US, I think it's something around 50 people are arrested for cannabis every minute. And that is, especially if you consider the collateral consequences of that arrest, even if you don't do a day in jail, it affects your ability to get a loan, or to get an apartment, or to get access to employment. And these are things that follow people for the rest of their lives. And, it's a lot worse in a lot of places outside of the United States. So, I mean, I think that starting from the point of prohibition has been an abject failure that causes more harm than good is really the appropriate framework. But we need to simultaneously start committing to more research right now, so that we can more quickly improve any sort of regulatory policies that we institute to replace prohibition. Those policies might not be perfect at first, but if we remove barriers to research now and actually start creating more space for social experiments with different types of regulatory structures and different types of control over these substances, we'll be in a much better place in a much shorter period of time than if we just start focusing on research now and waiting for the results to come in. Meanwhile, thousands, tens of thousands, sometimes even millions of people are being harmed by the status quo every single day.
Even medically speaking, if you can't access cannabis for a legitimate medicinal reason, you can be prosecuted for that on that basis as well. And I think very often that's certainly been the thing that's led over here in the UK, where it's the medical, that's the predominant. I mean, you can get access cannabis medically through a private prescription in the UK now. There are maybe at least there's 2 or 3 in Scotland, private clinics, predominantly Sapphire clinics, but there's at least a half dozen or so in England and around the rest of the UK where you can legally. But again, you have to pay upwards of a couple £100 a consultation, and then you're paying a monthly prescription, obviously, over and over. And it just seems inefficient, to say the least. I mean, you're dealing with a plant that is readily available. You can grow it yourself if it was to remove the stigma of being prosecuted. Not only that, I think very often one of the narratives that gets put across for individuals who have children, for instance, that need, like we obviously Epidiolex or Sativex or whatever particular medicine, very often they get offered from individuals who are compassionate to the situation, obviously homemade full plant spectrum extract kind of thing. And one of the things that I think would be beneficial is if they had availability for localized testing in the same method that a pharmaceutical company would be able to have. They test the product at the end so you know exactly what you're doing every time. Do you think that's a practical thing that you would be able to adopt in the States? Or do you think, is that something that's already available?
There are some places that will allow people that are engaging in home cultivation can do to go and test their products. But generally, if you're growing at home, you know exactly what's going into it. You know what's coming out of it. You might not know the exact cannabinoid or terpene levels, but you know for a fact that if you're growing in that certain way, it's not going to have any pesticides or any contaminants in it because you're completely in control of the process. And by the way, limited home cultivation should be a human right across the globe. There's no reason why you shouldn't be able to grow a handful of cannabis plants. If you're going to try to sell those, that's when regulations come in. But at the same time, like if you're just growing for personal consumption or for just like small level gifting to friends and relatives or to patients in need, that should be permitted across the board. It's not something that really anybody should be overly concerned about. And I think that there's a lot of misconstruation in that. There are, a small but vocal number of industry advocates that don't want any home cultivation. And honestly, I think that that's, both completely wrong in terms of justice and fairness, but it also means that, patients who are on a limited income or who can't travel outside of their homes to be able to access retail cannabis, whether through medical or adult use systems, don't have access, or it's at a price point that they can't afford, or they don't necessarily, or they aren't necessarily able to find the strain or the product that works best for them. And there's a lot that people can do with this plant at home that really just like meets exactly what their needs are, regardless of what they are, whether they're medical or adult use. Some people just might not like to be partaking in the regulated market structure. They should be able to grow those plants on their own. If they're starting to actually sell them for profit, then you actually have to start looking at regulation and figuring out ways to be able to control that a little bit more heavily for the sake of consumers, but also to make sure that it's not being diverted heavily into a large unregulated market. But in overall, I think that there would be a lot more available options for both patients and just regular consumers and home cultivators if these restrictions were lifted. As it stands now, the cost of licensing for a testing facility is usually so high that they can't really provide testing services to just individual home growers without just making it exorbitantly expensive. They can't really make it affordable in order for them to be able to pay for just their simple operations budget and pay their staff and pay for their licensing and all the things that they need to stay in regulatory compliance. They can't really afford to be using up gas chromatograph time or mass spectrometer time on, a single person that only wants to pay like, $20-$30 to get 1 gram sampled from their home grow. It just doesn't make sense for them financially. And also, it creates problems within the tightly regulated systems that currently exist, at least in the United States, on the state level, because then people who now all of a sudden have like a qualified, testing certificate can very easily use that to say, yes, I'm licensed, I'm regulated, and put these products into the regulated market. And that can be problematic as well. So, until we start seeing more of the barriers to entry, both for small businesses and for testing, and generally the restrictions starting to be lifted on a state by state and federal level, we're not going to be able to see real, reliable, affordable access to testing.
Frustratingly, the thing just when you mentioned about the getting licensing, it popped to mind that in the UK is hemp. Like there's a real issue with hemp over here where you can grow hemp. The license is extremely expensive to say the least, and the license timing is inconvenient for the grower because it very often conflicts with the grow season. All these little like irrelevant hurdles that just inhibit the ability to actually produce the end plant. And not only that, because very often the end product is exceeds 0.2%, very often the hemp tops have got to be cut off and left to rot in the ground in the UK. And it's just a bizarre notion that you grow this plant, but all that's considered, because obviously the hemp tops are considered as essentially narcotic. All you can have is the stems and the leaves. Do you deal with the same circumstance when it comes to the grown hemp? I mean, I remember, I think in the past couple of years, was it not the hemp farming bill? Was that a liberating process?
It was the General Farm Bill.
Oh, sorry.
But yeah, you're on the right track though. And I did not know that the UK was 0.2%. That's ridiculous. I mean, 0.3 we thought was restrictive, and there are a lot of efforts now to get that bumped up to 1, if not 2%.
Sorry, it might possibly be 0.3, but I know for a fact it's no more than 0.3, because there's certain active individuals who are really trying their best to make it. I think recently, it was maybe in the European Industrial Hemp Association, I think they proclaimed a win because they got to get to 0.3, and I thought that to myself, that like 1% would be enough, because then that gives you enough variable leeway for temperature and other variables that could potentially impact the crop.
Not only just in the crop and the harvesting aspect of it, but also if you're turning it into other products, at various stages along the production pathway, it will go well above that allowable level of delta-9 THC. And I don't know if it's actually been the case in practice, but the legal possibility is there for the authorities to crack down and bust everybody just during that particular stage of production, even though that's not what's going to be presented to consumers for actual production or for actual consumption. We're dealing with this issue a lot, and while we haven't seen a whole lot of it actually play out in practice, a lot of people are terrified that in the process of them turning their hemp flower, which is well below 0.3% THC, into a vapor product or an edible or something like that, at some point along the production schedule, that's going to test way higher. And if the authorities decide to do an inspection at that point and start testing products in various stages of completion, they're looking at federal prison time.
Yeah. So that's frightening, especially because of the fact that you really don't know at what stage that they could potentially test, and very often people's livelihoods are dependent on this. So they'll be able to engage continuously. We'll just pass it through. And all of a sudden, that one time when it got tested, it exceeded the regulatory benchmark that was required. So these are the things for the layman that's unaware of the intricacies behind cannabis legislation. These are the things I think that are. Not only they're not periphery; these are central issues that really need to be adjusted. And do you think all of these things, just federal legalization and then the rest follows? Do you think that's the main way? I mean, it seems impractical.
No, in general, I mean, at least in this country, what we've seen is that everything happens incrementally. There have been a lot of unfortunate situations in the past where people have let the perfect be the enemy of the good, and have tried to hold out for the law that they really want, as opposed to what they could get right that second. And really, when it comes down to it, the political situation might change a year or even months down the road, and you won't even be able to get the small thing that you weren't willing to compromise on. So, I really think that people need to look at this in an incremental fashion, but also with an eye on the prize in terms of sort of normalizing all, cannabinoid-based and cannabis plant-derived based products, and just figuring out different stages of what regulation they need based on the final end product for consumers, not necessarily on what the production process looks like or what the individual plants look like. What is the consumer actually consuming, and that dictating what the regulatory structure should look like. But waiting for national governments to do it as opposed to doing it state by state, we wouldn't have any legal states or even any medical states right now had we just waited on the federal government to do something uniform. It's always been incremental, and I think that even if you're looking at countries that don't have the federal system that the United States does, just making small pieces of progress, even if it's not exactly where you want to go. And you said, moving up 0.1% was heralded as this huge win. And, it doesn't seem like it, but it is. Every single time that you can actually make a little bit of progress and get lawmakers and members of parliament to actually support an incremental change, it makes them that much more comfortable making much bigger changes in the future. And it shifts the Overton window farther in the right direction so that you can ask for more and then bargain more in the next stage.
I think what the frustration I felt at the time was, it just felt like the opportunity, the dialogue was active at the time, and it felt like, why not take the most for what the opportunity presented, instead of putting point one, look, at least go for 0.7 or something that wasn't a fraction, it seemed. But you're 100% right, Morgan. Like, progress is progress, no matter the scale, really. And I think we'll be
ask
waiting.
For what you want, take what you can get.
Yeah, I think that can be said for a lot of things in life, really. But yeah, so as an organization, obviously you'll be experiencing, like, you'll have CBD companies, you'll have hemp companies, you'll have individuals that are recreational or medicinal. Do you see internal conflict amongst these demographics, or is there a general unity? I think you touched on it briefly there.
There's a little bit of that, but when I look at it at the end of the day, this market has only scratched the surface of what it could become, and there is more than enough to go around. And if you are like actively trying to fight over what is right now just an incremental section of the potential market share, you're doing both yourself and the people that you're competing with a disservice. And when it comes down to it, a rising tide raises all ships.
Yeah. That's poetic stuff, really is. But what do you see as a danger then, if you're from the perspective that you're engaged with on a daily basis? What do you see could potentially threaten a prosperous cannabis industry in the future that should really be addressed at these stages?
I think that one of the biggest things is overtaxation. There is a tendency among lawmakers pretty much everywhere to try to get as much tax revenue out of the cannabis industry as possible, despite the fact that it requires very little to actually regulate these systems and make sure that the administrative costs are covered. And that, when it comes down to, even looking at individual state budgets, it's a significant amount of money, but it's still mostly just a drop in the bucket when you're looking at their overall budgets. And yet there's a tendency among lawmakers to try to wring blood out of a stone. And once you set those high tax levels, it's very difficult to get lawmakers to actually bring them back down again, even though doing so would not only help to minimize the impact of the unregulated market, but would also eventually result in greater tax revenue overall in the long run. It's a real short-sighted mindset that I think is prevalent almost everywhere that is considering this, because of the misinterpretations about exactly what the social costs of cannabis legalization might be, even though we've got tons of experiential information available from states and countries that have done so, showing that the sky doesn't fall, and we're not dealing with like increases in teen use whatsoever. We're not dealing in any like direct causal relationships between that and like increased traffic fatalities. So I think a lot of times when these systems first start up, there's an inclination to just tax the hell out of them, that's bad for the industry, it's bad for the state, it's bad for the consumer.
It's actually ironic, because very often that's what's promoted almost internationally, certainly over here in the UK, of what could potentially be a benefit for the cannabis industry arriving, is that it's going to boost the economy. Think about taxes, not knowing that this could potentially, the irony of it being a positive thing to promote is actually going to damage the actual industry they're trying to promote in the long run. And I think the thing you mentioned there, the social impact, that's interesting, because that is, again, very often the narrative over here in the UK. Tons of teens are going to be consuming cannabis. And what's most kind of comical is that it seems to be, correct me if I'm wrong, but the data suggests that it's actually the elderly individuals over the age of 60 that seem to be the ones that pick up cannabis the most, it seems to be.
Well, dude, in the United States over the last year, there's a regular study that looks at teen drug use and other risk behavior. And over the last year, now, admittedly, some of this is probably attributable to the pandemic, but there was almost a 40% drop in overall cannabis consumption among high schoolers. It varied from grade to grade, but we've never seen that kind of a drop. And throughout the entire time I've been doing this, the rhetoric has been, think about the children. But when you're putting it behind the counter of a place that is worried about losing its license if they sell to a minor, as opposed to your neighborhood dealer who is specifically targeting minors, this is not an easy out or a difficult outcome to imagine. And yet the rhetoric has been the exact opposite. In general, the rhetoric is just focused on harms that have proven themselves not to come to pass when cannabis is made legal for adults and regulated in a safe manner. And, I think also when you're looking at the arguments about, the economic impact of it, a lot of people, particularly lawmakers, are only looking at it in terms of tax revenue. They're not looking at it in terms of, businesses that were failing, but that now have, a ton new customers to work with. I mean, I've talked to plumbers in Colorado that were about to go out of business in 2012 and are now, have several hundred employees and are raking in hundreds of millions of dollars a year, specifically off of the cannabis industry. And these are non-plant touching businesses. You can't just narrow it down to tax revenue. You have to think about the entire sphere of economic activity that is going on that previously either didn't exist or was only taking place in the underground market, where there was zero transparency and where in many cases it was being funneled to international and transnational drug trafficking organizations.
I think that's actually brilliant that you mentioned that there, because these periphery influences from the cannabis industry are crucial. They almost overtake the initial, like, hydroponics industry and individuals that are actively engaged with equipment that relate to cannabis or production or cultivation, extraction, and so forth, because you need other trades to create these circumstances, and these other trades have a knock-on effect, as you perfectly mentioned. It's extremely exciting when you think about it that way. And I think frustratingly that, again, taking it back to what we said at the beginning about education, individuals that are like lawmakers that are in positions of power when it comes to these transitions, being educated might contribute positively towards that, because they will see these periphery, because inevitably, unless you're like yourself active and you see this over the long term, from being active, they'll have no knowledge of these periphery influences. They'll have no knowledge that the societal structure, the economic response because of these places will be like, it'll skyrocket as a result, just because of passing through cannabis. So it's not linear. It's very much right across the board. This is it's an extremely exciting time. I think just one of the main frustration is, education is crucial. It seems to be to really get the most from it, because I mean, do you see that there is still space for the cannabis industry to not be as ferocious as it could be based on ignorant legislation?
Well, I mean, one of the things that I like to tell basically anybody that I'm talking to that doesn't really know too much about this business is that 2/3 of NCIA's member businesses are not plant touching. They're everything from plumbers to programmers, marketers, advertising companies, business software, anything that you could imagine for a modern integrated agricultural product. And when you look at just that membership base, when like only 1/3 of them are actually plant touching businesses that are involved in our organization and trying to push these laws, that should be just a huge bellwether, showing people that this is not just about cannabis. This is about a broad range of economic activity. And not only that, but given the fact that at present, and hopefully this will change, the barriers to entry to actually becoming involved on the plant touching side of the business are very, very high. Ancillary businesses provide opportunities for people that don't have access to capital to be able to take part in this industry with very little initial financial outlay and with very little risk. And so, I mean, this is creating opportunities that I think a lot of policymakers are just not seeing. So one of the jobs that we have is to educate them about that, and also working with economists to show what the true financial and economic impact of this industry is beyond just the licensees that are directly involved in creating and marketing or creating and distributing cannabis products.
That's very exciting. I mean, what are the main hurdles that you experience then when you're orchestrating these companies in the right direction? Is there something that repeatedly shows its head?
I mean, one of the things that I like to tell everybody that is thinking about getting involved in the cannabis industry is come at it from the angle of doing what you know. If you've never been a cultivator, if you've never worked in a greenhouse, if you're not a botanist, if you're not you don't have retail experience, you don't have experience in a testing lab, etc. Why would you want to shell out insane amounts of initial startup capital to do something that you have very little experience in, when you could be doing so at much less cost and much less risk, and much more effectively doing something that you actually know how to do and have the skills to apply, and potentially make way more money because you're not going to be taxed at nearly the same rates.
Yeah.
If you've got experience in marketing, start a cannabis marketing company. If you've got experience doing point of sale programming, start start developing programming and point of sale systems that work specifically in compliance with existing cannabis regulatory systems. Use what you know, as opposed to, and not to dissuade anybody from trying to go into the plant touching side of the industry, but really think about what your skill set is, what you have to offer, and what you can do outside of the direct plant touching side of the industry to help the whole industry grow and to help legitimize this plant.
Do you see any area of the cannabis industry that's not getting as much attention as it should be?
I think that there are probably a lot of them. I think a big one is, at least from my conversations with a lot of our members, are things like facilities design and quality control testing. Just in the time that I've been working here, I've talked to so many people who said that they've just been innovating nonstop in order to develop tools that are specifically useful to the cannabis industry, but that are now also useful for a wide range of both indoor, greenhouse, and outdoor cultivation that really didn't exist a little while ago. I mean, you can look at LED lighting as a perfect example. The leaps that LED lighting has made in technology and affordability over the last 5 years has been astounding, and it outpaced everything that market had done for the last 15 to 20 years. And now we're starting to see the applications that have been made possible because of the focus on the cannabis industry applicable in dozens of other industries. Yeah. And not just in ones that are directly related to agriculture. I mean, we're seeing it in computing. We're seeing it in a number of other areas.
I mean, cannabis has obviously always been known as green, all that kind of stuff, and I think obviously to maintain its green influence on the ecosystem is crucial. And very often that's potentially one of the criticisms that happens when it comes to the mass cannabis production, the carbon footprint as a consequence of that. Do you see from the inside any innovative steps, excluding LED lights, that are going to kind of contribute in a positive way towards a neutral carbon position?
Well, as it stands right now, the cannabis industry is not green at all. It is very unsustainable. And a lot of that is based on state and local regulations. There's some places where you have to grow inside, so that means you have to use lighting and electricity. There are some places where you're not allowed to reuse or recycle packaging, so I mean that creates huge waste problems. There are all sorts of places where sometimes you have 3 different levels of packaging that you have to use. There are so many different areas, and actually NCIA put out a primer on that last year, or maybe earlier this year, that goes into 5 or 6 areas of potential environmental impact in the cannabis industry that it examines the problems under the status quo and the ways in which it can improve, but really was meant to be sort of a baseline and a call to action to create more innovation. And there are so many people out there that are really looking at making the cannabis industry in its infancy one that holds sustainability and environmental impact as its very core values. So, part of the foundation upon which it's built, and something that other industries can model themselves after. But unfortunately, a lot of the innovations that could be applied are not able to actually be used because of an onerous or overly burdensome regulatory structure. So, there's a lot of people working right now with state level regulators, as well as with members of Congress and other policymakers, to try to bridge that gap and make sure that the cannabis industry is actually allowed to be as sustainable as it could be, and to create pathways for it to be able to continue to improve that aren't blocked by various regulatory barriers.
I certainly hope so, because that's I think a huge that'll be a huge win for the cannabis industry, because it's going to be ever emerging. It's going to continuously, excuse the pun, it's going to keep growing. But at the same time, there is this elephant in the room when it comes to the environmental impact as a consequence of that. And the last thing we would want is for cannabis to be known as this huge negative environmental impact as a consequence of the production methods.
Absolutely. I mean, and there's a perfect example of this. In most regulated cannabis systems, you're not even allowed to recycle your biomass. So after you strip the usable buds off it, and this even goes for like hemp production in some states, but primarily in the cannabis side of the industry, that you're just wasting all this valuable biomass that could be used for fiber and textiles and any number of other industrial or even medical applications, and it's just going to waste. It's just insane.
What is the reason for that? Because it has trace elements of THC.
I think that they're more worried about potential diversion, and they're worried about the like people reporting the amount of waste incorrectly,
Right.
and then where that quote unquote waste gets used, might include some actual usable, cannabis products. But also, I'm sure that in terms of the motivations for those laws, I'm sure in some states, like the fact that there was like a little bit of trace amount of THC or like a little bit of flower stuck on those stalks that somebody could go into the dumpster and strip off was one of their concerns. As silly as that is, like this is what we're dealing with here, and what we have been dealing with for almost 20 years now. And simple things like that, if you just take a step back and be a little bit reasonable, you'd see that, while, yeah, sure, maybe somebody could abuse this, but as long as there's transparency and oversight, the benefits far outweigh the potential harms.
Thanks to Morgan for giving me his time, and thanks to you for sticking around until the end of the video. I sincerely hope you enjoyed the content. I'll see you next time.